never worried about the man my wife worked with. I knew his name. I'd heard about his divorce, his problems, all of it. What I didn't know was why my wife suddenly cared so much about what happened to him. She defended him at home. She stayed late when he stayed late. And then one afternoon, I saw the two of them sitting together at a coffee shop. What I saw wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing how long it had been going on. The first time I realized my wife cared more about a man at work than she should, she was standing in our kitchen defending him. I hadn't even asked about him. She just walked in, set her purse on the counter, and said, "Evan didn't screw that order up." I looked up from my coffee. I didn't say he did. She stopped. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then she picked up her phone. "I've got to go." I watched her walk out the front door, and I remember thinking, why'd that matter so much to her? At the time, I didn't have an answer. Wish I could say I knew right then. I didn't. My name's David. I'm 58. Been married to Karen 27 years. I work as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant. Karen works in administration for a medical supply company. We have a son, Mike, who's 30, and 2 grandkids. Our life was pretty ordinary. We weren't one of those couples who did everything together. I had my garage. Karen had her work and her friends. On weekends, I'd usually find something to fix around the house. Karen would go shopping, meet her sister for lunch, or sit on the porch with a book. We'd been married long enough that we didn't need to account for every hour of the day. At least, that's how I saw it. I trusted her. Evan had started working with Karen about a year before all this happened. I knew his name because Karen mentioned him sometimes at dinner. Usually, it was nothing important. Evan forgot to send the paperwork again, or Evan's going through a rough divorce. I'd say something like, sounds like he's got a lot going on. Then we'd move on. But gradually, Evan started showing up in more of our conversations. One evening, Karen came home irritated. "They're blaming Evan for that shipment." I was eating dinner. "What happened?" "He didn't even handle that part." "Then why are they blaming him?" "Because he's the easiest person to blame." I shrugged. "Sounds like a work problem." She looked at me. "It is." Then she went quiet. I remember that. She didn't say anything else. A few weeks later, Evan made another mistake. This time, Karen was even more upset. She stood at the kitchen counter explaining what happened while I was putting the dishes away. "They're making a big deal out of nothing," I said. "What did he do?" "He entered the wrong numbers into the system." "That sounds like a mistake." It was. But they're acting like he did it on purpose. I dried my hands. "Well, if he made the mistake..." "He didn't mean to." I looked at her. She kept going. She explained who was responsible, who should have caught it, why Evan was under pressure, and why his manager was being unfair. Went on for almost 20 minutes. Finally, I said, "Karen, you work with the guy. You don't have to defend him to me." She looked at me like I'd said something offensive. "I'm just telling you what happened." "Okay." I went back to the dishes. She picked up her purse. Looking back, that was probably the first warning sign. Not that she talked about him. It was how much his problems mattered to her. Then Karen started staying late. At first, it was once in a while. "Busy?" "Yeah, we're behind." "Who else is staying?" She'd pause. "Some of us." I didn't push. Wasn't gonna start interrogating my wife every time she worked late. But I started noticing something. She stayed late mostly on the days Evan was there. If he had a late shift, Karen somehow seemed to have one too. I didn't write it down, didn't make a chart. Just noticed. One Tuesday, I called her around 6. "Are you coming home?" "Probably another hour." "Everything okay?" "Yeah, just work." "Want me to save dinner?" "Don't worry about me." I put the phone down. When she got home, she smelled like the cold air outside. I asked how work went. "Fine." That was it. Another time, she changed clothes before going to work. She'd been wearing jeans and a sweatshirt that morning. Then, around lunchtime, she went upstairs and came back down wearing a nicer blouse. I looked at her. Something going on at work? No. She grabbed her keys. Why? Nothing. She stared at me a second. Then she left. I remember standing in the kitchen after the door closed. I could have asked. I didn't. Didn't want to become suspicious of my own wife without a reason. Then one evening, her phone buzzed on the counter. She was standing right beside it. She picked it up quick. I hadn't been trying to read it. I just happened to see the name. Evan. And the message underneath it. "Thanks for last night. I don't know what I'd do without you." Karen turned the phone over. I looked at her. "What's that about?" "Work." "At night?" She sighed. Evan was having a hard time. "With what?" "His divorce." I nodded. "Okay." She picked up her phone and walked into the other room. A few minutes later, I heard the back door open. She went outside. I stood there with my coffee. I didn't follow her. Didn't need to. Something had changed. Just wasn't sure what. Over the next couple weeks, I started seeing little things I hadn't paid attention to before. Karen kept her phone with her more. She'd take it into the bathroom. She'd put it face down when we sat at the table. If a message came in, she'd look at it before answering me. Sometimes she'd smile at the screen. I'd ask, "Something funny?" She'd lock the phone. "No." "Okay." She also seemed to know a lot about Evan. More than I remembered her knowing about anybody else at work. She knew when his divorce hearing was. She knew his ex-wife was giving him trouble. She knew what his daughter was studying. She knew he'd been having trouble sleeping. One night I said, "You guys talk a lot." She looked at me. "What's that mean?" "Nothing. Because it sounds like it means something." I shook my head. "Forget it." She picked up her glass of water. "I'm just trying to help somebody who's having a rough time." I nodded. Maybe that was true. Maybe I was making too much of it. Then I saw him. It was a Thursday afternoon. I'd finished work early and stopped at a coffee shop across town. I wasn't looking for Karen. Needed coffee, and had a little time before I went home. Her car was parked outside. I knew that car right off. I'd helped her replace the battery the winter before. I pulled into a space farther down the street. I sat there a moment. Then I looked through the window. Karen was sitting across from Evan. They weren't doing anything dramatic. No kissing. No holding hands. Just talking. But Karen leaned forward when he spoke. She reached across the table and touched his arm. Just for a second. Evan smiled. And the way he looked at her told me this wasn't a conversation about paperwork. I knew that look. Maybe not from another relationship. But I knew what it meant when two people were comfortable with each other, in a way they didn't need to explain. I sat there maybe 30 seconds. Then I started the truck and drove home. I didn't confront him, didn't walk inside and make a scene, didn't call Evan. I wasn't gonna do something I'd regret because I was angry. That night, Karen walked through the door around 7. Work was a mess. I looked at her. Yeah? Yeah. We got stuck there forever. I nodded. Must have been. She put her purse down. What's wrong? Nothing. She looked at me another second. Then she went into the kitchen. I followed a few minutes later. She started making something to eat. I watched her open the refrigerator. The ordinary parts of our life were still happening. That was the strange thing. The refrigerator still hummed. The dishwasher still needed unloading. Her shoes were still by the door, and I was standing there knowing something wasn't right. A few days later, I asked her direct, "Is something going on with Evan?" She stared at me. No. Nothing? No. I waited. Then she said, "Why would you even ask that?" I looked at her. "I've seen you together." Her face changed. Not much, but enough. She sat down. "David, how long?" She didn't answer. "Karen." She rubbed her hands together. "I don't know." "How long?" Finally, she said, "A few months." I sat across from her. "How many times have you met him outside work?" "I don't know." "Karen." "Several." I nodded slow. "Are you sleeping with him?" She looked down. "No." Then she added, almost defensive, "I never slept with him." That sentence told me more than she probably meant it to. She thought that was the line. Like everything before, that didn't count. I asked about the coffee shop. She admitted they'd met there several times. Sometimes after work, sometimes for dinner. Said they talked about work. Then she admitted they talked about other things too. His divorce, her problems, our marriage. Things she hadn't told me. That part bothered me more than the coffee. Another man knew things about my wife that I didn't. I sat there listening. Finally, I asked, "Do you have feelings for him?" She started crying. I didn't mean for it to happen. I looked at her. "That's not what I asked." She wiped her face. "Yes." I looked down at the table. 27 years of marriage. And another man had slowly become the person she turned to when she was upset. She defended him, made time for him, worried about him, protected their conversations. And every time I'd noticed something, she'd given me just enough of an explanation to make me question myself. I wasn't innocent in all this. I'd quit asking questions because it was easier. I wanted to believe the marriage was fine. Maybe I didn't want to know the answer. But knowing now, I couldn't pretend anymore. I didn't yell, didn't call Evan, didn't threaten anybody. Just said, "If you want this marriage, then this has to stop." She looked at me. "I don't know if I can do that." That hurt, but it also made the decision easier. I said, "Then we have a different problem." For the next few weeks, we lived in the same house but barely lived together. We ate at different times, slept in separate rooms, talked about bills and groceries, because those things still had to get done. But the marriage itself was sitting there between us. Sometimes, we'd pass each other in the hallway, and neither one would say anything. One Saturday morning, I was working on a cabinet hinge in the garage when Karen came outside. "Are you going to tell Mike?" I kept working. "I don't know. He doesn't need to know everything." "I agree." She stood there a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry." I nodded. "I know." But sorry wasn't an answer. Karen eventually told me she couldn't promise to end things with Evan, so I stopped trying to convince her. We started separating our finances. I met with an attorney. We looked at the house, retirement accounts, insurance, and what moving out would actually involve. Wasn't dramatic, was paperwork. That somehow made it worse. 27 years of marriage reduced to folders, account statements, and conversations about who was going to take which piece of furniture. Karen rented a small apartment. Our son eventually realized something serious had happened. He asked me one night, "Dad, is Mom seeing somebody?" I looked at him. "There's another man involved." He was quiet. "Do you want me to stop talking to her?" "No." "Are you sure? She's still your mother." He looked down. "Are you okay?" I almost said yes. Instead, I said, "I'm getting there." That was probably the most honest answer I could give him. Karen and Evan eventually stopped being something hidden. And once they were no longer hidden, some of the excitement seemed to disappear. I didn't ask, didn't care enough to find out. That surprised me. For a while, I thought I'd spend every day wondering where she was. Instead, I got tired of wondering. I stopped checking her phone, stopped asking where she was, stopped trying to compete with Evan. Wasn't anything to compete for. I went back to my garage, started fixing things I'd ignored for years, spent more time with Mike and the grandkids, started eating dinner at the kitchen table again, even when I was alone. Some nights were rough. I'm not going to pretend they weren't. There were evenings when I'd come home from work and still expect to hear Karen moving around upstairs. Then I'd remember. The house would be quiet. But eventually the quiet stopped feeling like something I had to fight. A few months later, I was cleaning out a drawer in the garage when I found an old restaurant receipt. Karen and I had gone there years earlier. I remembered the night. Nothing special, just dinner. We'd talked about our son. Think we'd argued about whether we should replace the kitchen table. I looked at the receipt a few seconds. Then I threw it away. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. My phone was on the table beside me. For a long time, that phone had been something I watched, waiting for a message, wondering who was calling, wondering where Karen was. Now it just sat there. A few minutes later, I heard a truck coming up the driveway. My grandson jumped out and ran toward the house. I got up and opened the door. For a long time, I'd been trying to figure out where my wife was giving her attention. I wasn't doing that anymore. I had my own life to take care of.